Welcome back to the Jumpify Labs podcast. Today's guest is someone who scaled organizations from tens of millions to hundreds of millions and has led to the highest levels of the nonprofit world. John Walter has spent over 2 decades driving growth at the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, and he's now advising leaders on how to scale without falling into the traps that cripple most nonprofits. John, welcome to the show.
To be here, Jay.
Why don't you tell our listeners what part of Florida you're based at these days?
So I'm actually based on the West Coast in Fort Myers. That's where I work from right now. Mainly as a consultant, but we're in the rainy season, so things are a little wet here right now.
Well, it's good to have some seasons. I personally am from San Diego, and we have year-round sunshine. It gets cold, but yeah, I guess I'm a little spoiled.
You're blessed.
Yeah, absolutely. How did you actually find yourself drawn to nonprofit work after starting in pharma and in finance?
So, great question. What I made a move out of for-profit is actually working for a brokerage firm in Manhattan. Someone, recruiter called me and said, John, what do you think about this opportunity? I said, oh, I'll give it a try. I'm looking to get out of what I'm doing and be more on a direct line, basis, working for a company. And actually went to work for the March of Dimes. And what I've learned quickly working in nonprofit was if you're smart, willing to work hard, and can get things done, you actually can be pretty successful in nonprofit. So March of Dimes led to Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, which turned out to be, as you mentioned, almost 20 years of my career.
Yeah. Can you walk us a little bit about how you helped scale the
Sure.
LNL Society from 40 mil to nearly 400 mil?
Yeah. So in 1995, I joined the organization, and they were raising, at the time, probably around $35 million. And by the time I left as CEO in 2014, we were raising close to $400 million. And really that involved, the success of a particular event that we were running for the organization. But the challenge really was the infrastructure that was in place, or better said, there was no infrastructure in place. There was barely infrastructure in place to run a $35 million organization, let alone a $400 million organization. And so what we quickly had to do was peel back what are the pieces that are going to be necessary to grow the organization first and foremost, but at the same time scale it so that we could sort of build base, and grow everything from our back office functions such as finance or HR, but probably most importantly, the IT area, which again, non-existent. We had a phone system at our national office that couldn't call all the areas of the country because it was so old. So, really week by week, day by day, as the dollars came in, we forced ourselves to push as much money as we could towards our mission, but at the same time, build and scale the organization, in each of those areas to do that. Of course, marketing, communication, sales, and so forth were intricate parts of that, but really keeping things running was the greatest challenge. A lot of funny stories I could tell about that, about those early days of having all those things and not being able to process.
That's pretty funny how you say the phone couldn't even dial outside the area code. I know I look young, but I'm actually 41 years old, and I remember anytime you had to dial the 3 digits of an area code, I would get in trouble because that was long distance.
Yeah, but we were actually using calling cards because there were so many new area codes. The phone system was 20 years old; they didn't exist, and it didn't make sense to upgrade that system. So, but yeah, a
Yeah,
little bit of humor, but just even simple things like that we had to do in order to run and manage because we were in about 40 states at the time. By the time we were done, we were in all 50. We were also in Canada, and had a small operation in the UK as well. So, it was a lot of learning, a lot of on the job learning, and I think accessing people and really just getting things done and asking people for help along the way.
exactly. You mentioned staying true to the mission, and then also we're discussing scaling. For nonprofits, it's a little bit different, right? Because nonprofits have to stay true to that mission while also balancing growth and scaling. How do nonprofits actually do that?
So I think that's a good question, and not all of them do it well. Coming out of for-profit business, I kind of looked at it from the perspective of really a nonprofit isn't any different than a for-profit business, except for one thing. You don't have stockholders, you have stakeholders, and your excess profits are not paid out in dividends and earnings and so on and so forth. Your excess profits go towards your mission. And so therefore, being effective, being efficient, being crystal clear in terms of what your mission is, and more importantly, what your mission isn't, because the risk always is trying to be all things to all people, which no organization can do. And in a nonprofit space, it's even harder because the need is this big, it's enormous. And invariably having a clear, crisp definition of what your mission is critical.
Absolutely. I want to pull back from your experience a little bit because looking back, was there any decisions during your journey that maybe scared you a little bit or scared you a lot, but ultimately paid off in the end?
Uh, the greatest challenge that we had was, again, we're doing throwback, right? So internet was still nascent. Online processing of credit cards and checks and so forth didn't really exist. But we were in a situation where we had 40,000 people participating in an event that were primarily collecting checks to support their efforts. And those checks had to be processed. Online processing at the bank didn't exist. And, I needed to find a third party outlet that could do this for us because there was no way we could scale up and build a lockbox, if you will, within the organization that processed these things. And so I partnered with someone who was involved with the organization, and they actually built that back office for us to do that. To your point, it scared me to death because if it didn't work, the event failed, the organization failed, and notwithstanding, I failed too. So, that was probably, I mean, there were many along the way, but as we grew and got more confident, I could go to my IT department and say at one point, look, I need you to build an online resource so that we can process these things directly to consumer and bypass all the back office of doing this because the volume was so great. And, we were actually able to do that. But those early days and this company that helped us out, out of Cincinnati was a godsend because they saved this in a lot of ways. But the risk was, could they really do it?
You took a gamble, an educated guess, an educated decision, and it paid off. You have to do something, right? You can't just stay stagnant and keep doing what the team has previously been doing because clearly, if you want different results, you need to take different actions.
Well, I'll let your viewers laugh. So what really got me this, I went to one of our locations that was the most successful location that we had. And the executive director says, John, I need to show you something. We're having a problem. And she brings me to a locked room and opens a door. And inside that room was literally probably 1,000 shoeboxes full of checks that they couldn't keep up processing. First of all, this is a risk nightmare that I'm looking at, but at the same time, an organizational nightmare in terms of, okay, we need to figure out a way to figure this out.
That sounds definitely high risk. A lot of temptation all
The
around.
good news is those problems don't exist anymore, and there's simple solutions that the banks have, that the internet has, and so on and so forth. But you know, there are things coming down the pike that I'm sure would be similar.
Exactly. Yeah, you've also said in our previous conversation that the CEO to the board, that relationship is typically the number one challenge for nonprofits. Can you go into a little bit of why that is?
Well, sure. And actually, along those lines, I'm sort of offline working on a book that really deals with this. And while a nonprofit board is very similar to a corporate board, it's different in a unique way. They have a true governance role over the organization. They hire, fire, and remunerate the CEO. And people come to boards for a variety of reasons. In some cases, because it's very personal, the mission's very personal to the individual, and they want to truly, really try and help. In other cases, they're philanthropic and they want to, support the organization. And others, in many ways, it's a resume builder for an accountant, for a lawyer, for a real estate person in the local community. And so you're working oftentimes with a board that's very diverse, and in some cases highly focused and highly attuned on what it takes to get something done, and in a lot of cases not at all. And so the other difference that I would say is this, is that nonprofit boards really need to be a partner to the CEO and help that CEO and that senior staff and notwithstanding the organization figure out how to build and grow and leverage their resources, both personal resources as well as their business resources, to help the organization grow. Not tell the CEO what to do, and that's all your problem. Because the way I view it is, in a nonprofit board, you want a partner, you don't want a pundit, because anybody can tell. I can always tell you what to do, but if I'm not here and saying, "Hey, Jay, let's work together on this. Here's some things that I could bring to the table. Here are things you bring to the table. How do we come together and really partner on this and make it happen?" That, I would say, and I've worked for now probably five nonprofits. That relationship what I would characterize as almost the secret sauce of managing the tension that exists between, okay, yeah, your board has to be governing board, but at the same time, they got to be 100% on board and invested with the organization to make it successful.
Yeah, healthy partnership for sure would be a lot more productive, of course, in any situation.
I mean, it sounds simple, and there's probably thousands of books written on how to create and structure a nonprofit governing board. None of them deal with this issue.
Mm. And where do most boards actually go wrong when they think they're actually helping?
When they when they sit back and tell you what to do, many of them don't work in the nonprofit space. In fact, most don't. So they don't really understand the relationship of, say, a field organization with a national office and how to sort of build and motivate those relationships and really understand what motivates people to give. Because the idea of charity, of giving, is not necessarily about an organization asking you for money. It's me as your friend asking you for money. So it's more friend raising than it is fundraising. And it sounds, again, that sounds simple, but it's not, because what happens oftentimes with the board is, oh, we have a great organization, it's a great cause, we're doing great things, everybody's going to want to give us money. And the facts are that, a charity has a network of people who are bought into that charity. If it's a disease charity, it's that disease. And then it's the network of the people who have that disease and their friends that help support that organization. And, I can't tell you the number of times I've sat in a room and said, well, Bill Gates has a lot of money. Let's call Bill and ask him for some money. Well, the facts are, if you don't know Bill, he's not going to take my call. And he's got his own commitments and things that, he's most interested in. And I just point him out as an example because it's one that's been, sort of thrown around at board meetings all the time. And board members, just like I'm looking at you now and saying, well, do you know Bill? Because if we do, then maybe you can set up a meeting for us. But if you don't, don't say something like that, because the truth is, it's kind of stupid. It's a little naive.
Right. Yeah, that sounds like an interesting story. Do you have any other stories that actually helped you to make this decision to actually rewrite your book? Maybe any stories or examples that actually inspired you to put pen to paper?
Well, I'd say first and foremost, the journey is a little cathartic for me, because in many ways, I've found that working and improving is more about learning how not to do things as opposed to how to do them. You're laughing, but it's very, very true. And what I would say is, and so being cathartic is part of writing the book, right? Just talking about this, but at the same time, part of the reason for writing the book is my situation is not unique. I mean, many people who have worked for me have gone on to go and run other organizations, and are still running them today. And, when we get together and talk on a call, or if I happen to be in town and meeting with them, it often comes to, oh, I have a board meeting coming up in a couple of weeks and I got to do this or that to get ready for it. And I really don't find those board meetings productive, and, would like them to be more like this, in terms of problem solving, as opposed to all the things that you're doing wrong.
Mm. Okay, yeah, I want to take a small pivot to venture philanthropy and biotech investing. I know we touched a little bit on it. What made you believe that nonprofits should directly invest in biotech?
Sure. So keep in mind, all of my career really was in health charities, right? So solving disease problems. And I think the main reason there was pretty simple. In our mission statement, so why are we here? What are we going to accomplish and want to do? Was so always find cures. We want to find a cure for cancer. We want to find a cure for this rare disease and improve the quality of people's lives, right? The challenge often was that most nonprofits historically, this has changed now in the last 10 or 15 years. But early on, the only organization that was doing this was the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. They were sort of the bellwether back in the late 90s of saying, it needs to be both and, not either or. And by that, I mean basic science, early research, and biotech investment, and really looking at how you can marry the two and manage the risk that relates to that. So for me, the organization I worked for years was a basic research organization. And when I became CEO, I said, if we're really invested in cures, we've got to be talking to pharma, and we've got to be talking to biotech, because ultimately, even if we find a breakthrough discovery in a lab, in one of the labs we're funding, it's going to have to get to that space. So let's talk to them now. Let's talk to them early. Let's bring them in and let them know the work that we're funding and where there might be synergies and opportunities for investment. And then, notwithstanding, when an opportunity exists, directly invest in that. In other words, create an opportunity for an ROI, return on investment, for the charity if those things were to be successful. And so all the organizations I worked at, including Leukemia and Lymphoma Society and the ones after that, I always encourage them to do that direct investing because if you believe in finding cures, you're really sort of honor bound to do it. But at the same time, you create opportunities for finding cures. And I think one of the things that I found as I built out the program and talked to people, it's much, much easier for them to understand that kind of opportunity than it is to talk about, well, we're gonna bring in all these fruit flies and we're gonna dissect them and we're gonna do things to them and it's gonna mimic the disease. And if it mimics the disease, we might be able to take that and bring that and do that into mice or rats or whatever. And honestly, what I found when you start to talk about those things, most people, unless they're really into, science, would go cross-eyed as opposed to, oh, here's an opportunity. It's going to be a phase 1 trial. We're going to be in humans. We're going to try and solve this particular disease set. The phase 1 trial is very risky. We're going to bring in 15, 20, 30 patients. And if it's successful, we'll get into phase 2. And if it's not, then it will stop and will fail. And, you asked about stories earlier. When I first introduced this subject, the research scientists' comment about doing it was, well, that's so risky. And my response at the time was, listen, there's nothing more risky than basic science. We've been doing it for 50 years. How many stories do we have? Both are necessary. And that's why I'm a big believer in both and not either.
Outstanding. That's a really good perspective to share. What are some of those risks? John, you mentioned that there's risk. Someone's going to think this is risky for someone in the nonprofit space. What are some of those risks that they should be aware of when they decide to play in this space?
It's expensive, right? A phase 1 trial, when you're dealing with humans, you're working with the FDA. You've got to get approval for things. I think they talk about now that it takes about $2.4 billion to bring a drug to market, which again is why you need the pharmaceutical industry to help you along the way. Early on, a phase 1 trial might cost anywhere between 50 or $100 million. So the nonprofit can't be the lead, but the nonprofit can be a partner really in 2 ways. The first is dollars and cents, right? Because in some cases, particularly or pre-phase 1, it's $5-10 million that a group might be looking for to try and advance to a phase 1 trial. And so the other part of it is, in many ways, for those suffering, say, from a particular disease, having a partner, a nonprofit partner, vetting the science, looking at the opportunity, understanding the risk, is a value add to that organization when they go out to the public and raise money. So they're not only saying, look, we're trying to solve this, but we have XYZ organization as a partner. They vetted our science. They've gone with them. And in some cases, our scientists have actually gone and met with the venture capital firms that are the ones that are really investing the big dollars to try and advance and move these things forward.
And where do you actually see the future of nonprofit and biotech? Where do you see the future collaboration going?
So I'm not 100% sure. Not everybody is on board with this, and I would say that right now, talking to people, fundraising is a huge problem. And within a research organization, you still have this tension of we need to be doing basic research and we need to be doing translational research. And yeah, we'd really like to do venture philanthropy. In some cases, you can't do all 3. And the board, as a governing body really needs to sit down and say, where are we going to put our money? Because if we spread it out, we're not going to be effective. I can think of one organization that today really has taken that journey from early on in, say, 2000, funding only translational science, not basic science, and today 85% of their portfolio is my percentages may be off, but about 85% of their portfolio right now is direct investment in biotech. And so they've taken that journey and that learning from other organizations and said, this is where we're going to put our dollars. This is what our risk tolerance is going to be. And this is how we're going to be most effective.
Wow. My next question was going to be, if you had $50 million to allocate, what area would you want to bet on?
Well, so it really depends on the disease state. So cancer head research has been going on for 120 years. So the basic science has matured and the understanding of it hasn't. I worked and ran a rare disease organization where there was really a lack of understanding of what the basic and underlying causes were. But even there, we were able to take what they'd done for the first 15 years of running their basic science program and look at opportunities where we could work with biotech and do, early stage trials. And I mean, I'm happy to say in that particular case with that organization, just this year, they brought a drug to market in partnership with a biotech. The first drug ever for, in this case, this is Prader-Willi syndrome, which is a rare genetic disorder that occurs in vitro. And then a baby's born with significant health problems. But now that organization has its first approved drug for that that genetic disorder, and there's about 4 or 5 more that are either in phase 2 or phase 3 trials that could potentially help that community enormously. So, you know, I'm a big believer in doing both, but you've got to first examine the science. To your question, $50 million, it might be, heavily invested early on to try and figure out the basic science. But at some point in time, as discovery is found, looking at who's doing work in a related space or maybe even possibly unrelated space, and how do we bring them to the table and have, a conversation, or in many ways create a consortium so that, you can really leverage what's out there. Because the other thing nonprofits do is is look at things a little bit in a vacuum, as opposed to look at things from a universal perspective and say, who's doing what work, what are things that could help, and to really be, thinking broadly about that.
You've dropped a lot of wisdom here. A lot of experience is clear and apparent when you're talking about your past history, the things you've done in the past. But what is the biggest leadership lesson that you'd want our audience to walk away with?
If you're going to work in a nonprofit space, and particularly in a leadership role, you really want to spend time getting to know who your board is and who your partners are and what their motivations are and what their willingness to help is. I'll pick on lawyers a little bit here. Lawyers oftentimes will say to you, well, I can't give you money, but I'm giving you all this time. And you know what my billable hours are worth? And my response has been, in some cases, which is say, I can't spend your billable hours. So you're either going to write a check and support what we're doing, or maybe you should think about spending your time elsewhere. So I think it's spend time to know who your board is and know what the level and degree of their commitment is to the organization, both in time and notwithstanding financially, because you can't do it by yourself. And I've been in way too many situations where the board has looked at me and said, well, it's your job to raise the money, John. And, I've had to say, no, it's our job to raise the money.
Going back to the whole partnership collaboration aspect of them. All right, John, where can people find and connect with you if they want to learn more?
So if they want to learn more, my email address, john.e.walter.jr@gmail.com. I'm happy to talk to you. I talk to people all the time. I'm looking to do consultative work. If people want to, explore these questions and see how they might grow and evolve their organization. So I appreciate the opportunity, Jay, for speaking with you and seeing who might be of interest, in and how I might be able to help, build and grow an organization.
Very clear that you have a lot of experience to share. You could help people dodge a bunch of bullets and navigate away from those pitfalls before they drop in there.
For it.
John, thank you so much for gracing us with your time. If you like stories like this, and if you want to hear from more leaders like John, tune into the Jumbo Labs podcast, where we are bringing more people just like him every single day and giving more value to you so you can help and grow your business or help and grow your clients. Thanks so much.